Chapter 30 of Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 30. In the diminishing daylight they went along the level roadway through the meads, which stretched away into grey miles, and were backed into the extreme edge of distance by the swarthy and abrupt slopes of Egdon Heath. On its summit stood clumps and stretches of fir trees, whose notched tips appeared like battlemented towers, crowning black-fronted castles of enchantment. They were so absorbed in the sense of being close to each other that they did not begin talking for a long while, and the silence being broken only by the clucking of the milk in the tall cans behind them. The lane they followed was so solitary that the hazelnuts had remained on the boughs till they slipped from their shells, and the blackberries hung in heavy clusters. Every now and then Angel would fling the lash of his whip round one of these, pluck it off, and give it to his companion. The dull sky soon began to tell its meaning by sending down herald drops of rain, and the stagnant air of the day changed into a fitful breeze which played about their faces. The quicksilvery glaze on the rivers and pools vanished. From broad mirrors of light they changed to lustreless sheets of lead, with a surface like a rasp. But that spectacle did not affect her preoccupation. Her countenance, a natural carnation slightly embrowned by the season, had deepened its tinge with the beating of the raindrops, and her hair, which the pressure of the cow's flanks had, as usual, caused to tumble down from its fastenings and stray beyond the curtain of her calico bonnet, was made clammy by the moisture, till it hardly was better than seaweed. "I ought not to have come, I suppose," she murmured, looking at the sky. "I am sorry for the rain," said he, "but how glad I am to have you here." Remote Egdon disappeared by degrees behind the liquid gauze. The evening grew darker, and roads being crossed by gates, it was not safe to drive faster than at a walking pace. The air was rather chill. "I am so afraid you will get cold with nothing upon your arms and shoulders," he said. "Creep close to me, and perhaps the drizzle won't hurt you much. I should be sorrier still if I did not think that the rain might be helping me." She imperceptibly crept closer, and he wrapped round them both a large piece of sailcloth, which was sometimes used to keep the sun off the milk cans. Tess held it from slipping off him as well as herself, Clare's hands being occupied. "Now we are all right again." "Oh no, we are not. It runs down into my neck a little, and it must still be more into yours. That's better. Your arms are like wet marble, Tess. Wipe them in the cloth. Now, if you want to stay quiet, you will not get another drop. Well, dear, about that question of mine, that long-standing question." The only reply that he could hear for a little while was the smack of the horses' hoofs on the moistening road, and the cluck of the milk in the cans behind them. "Do you remember what I said?" "I do," she replied. "Before we get home, mind." "I'll try." He said no more then. As they drove on, the fragment of an old manor house of Caroline date rose against the sky, and was in due course passed and left behind. "That," he observed, to entertain her, "is an interesting old place, one of the several seats which belong to an ancient Norman family formerly of great influence in this country, the d'Urbervilles. I never pass one of their residences without thinking of them. There's something very sad in the extinction of a family of renown, even if it was fierce, domineering, feudal renown." "Yes," said Tess.
They crept along towards a point in the expanse of shade just at hand at which a feeble light was beginning to assert its presence, a spot where by day a fitful white streak of stream, at intervals beyond the dark green background, denoted intermittent moments of contact between their secluded world and modern life. Modern life stretched out its stream feeler to this point 3 or 4 times a day, touched their native existences, and quickly withdrew its feeler again, as if what it touched had been uncongenial. They reached the feeble light, which came from the smoky lamp of a little railway station, a poor enough terrestrial star, yet in one sense of more importance to Talbothays Dairy and mankind than the celestial ones to which it stood in such humiliating contrast. The cans of new milk were unladen in the rain, Tess getting a little shelter from a neighbouring holly tree. Then there was the hissing of a train, which drew up almost silently upon the wet rails, and the milk was rapidly swung, can by can, into the truck. The light of the engine flashed for a second upon Tess Durbeyfield's figure, motionless under the great holly tree. No object could have looked more foreign to the gleaming cranks and wheels than this unsophisticated girl, with the round bare arms, the rainy face and hair, the suspended attitude of a friendly leopard at pause, the print gown of no date or fashion, and the cotton bonnet drooping on her brow. She mounted again beside her lover, with a mute obedience characteristic of impassioned natures at times, and when they had wrapped themselves up over head and ears in the sailcloth again, they plunged back into the now thick night. Tess was so receptive that the few minutes of contact with the whirl of material progress lingered in her thought. "Londoners will drink it at their breakfast to-morrow, won't they?" she asked. "Strange people that we have never seen." "Yes, I suppose they will, though not as we send it, when its strength has been lowered, so that it might not get up into their heads." "Noble men and noble women, ambassadors and centurions, ladies and tradeswomen, and babies who have never seen a cow." "Well, yes, perhaps, particularly centurions." "Who don't know anything of us, and where it comes from, or think how we two drove miles across the moor to-night in the rain that it might reach them in time." "We did not drive entirely on account of these precious Londoners. We drove a little on our own, on account of that anxious matter which you will, I'm sure, set at rest, dear Tess. Now, permit me to put it in this way. You belong to me already, you know. Your heart, I mean, does it not?" "You know as well as I. Oh yes, yes." "Then if your heart does, why not your hand?" "My only reason was on account of you, on account of a question. I have something to tell you." "But suppose it to be entirely for my happiness and my worldly convenience also?" "Oh yes, if it is for your happiness and worldly convenience. But my life before I came here, I want—" "Well, it is for my convenience as well as my happiness. If I have a very large farm, either English or colonial, you will be invaluable as a wife to me, better than a woman out of the largest mansion in the country. So please, please, dear Tessie, disabuse your mind of the feeling that you will stand in my way." "But my history, I want you to know it. You must let me tell you. You will not like me so well." "Tell it if you wish to, dearest. This precious history, then. Yes, I was born at so-and-so, Anno Domini." "I was born at Marlott," she said, catching at his words as a help, lightly as they were spoken. "And I grew up there, and I was in the 6th standard when I left school, and they said I had a great aptness and should make a good teacher, so it was settled that I should be one. But there was trouble in my family. Father was not very industrious, and he drank a little." "Yes, yes, poor child. Nothing new." He pressed her more closely to his side. "And then there is something very unusual about it, about me. I was—" Tess's breath quickened. "Yes, dearest, never mind." I am not a Durbeyfield, but a d'Urberville, a descendant of the same family as those that occupied the old house we passed, and we are all gone to nothing." "A d'Urberville, indeed! And is that all the trouble, dear Tess?" "Yes," she answered faintly. "Well, why should I love you less after knowing this?" "I was told by the dairyman that you hated old families." "Well, it is true in one sense. I do hate the aristocratic principle of blood before everything, and do think that as reasoners the only pedigrees we ought to respect are those spiritual ones of the wise and virtuous, without regard to corporeal paternity. But I am extremely interested in this news. You can have no idea how interested I am. Are you not interested yourself in being one of that well-known line?" "No. I have thought it sad, especially since coming here and knowing that many of the hills and fields I see once belonged to my father's people. But other hills and fields belong to Retty's people, and perhaps others to Marian's, so that I don't value it particularly." "Yes, it is surprising how many of the present tillers of the soil were once owners of it, and I sometimes wonder that a certain school of politicians don't make a capital out of the circumstance, but they don't seem to know it. I wonder that I did not see the resemblance of your name to d'Urberville and trace the manifest corruption. And this was the carking's secret." She had not told. At the last moment her courage had failed her. She feared his blame for not telling him sooner. Her instinct of self-preservation was stronger than her candour. "Of course," continued the unwitting Clare, "I should have been glad to know you to be descended exclusively from the long-suffering, dumb, unrecorded rank and file of the English nation, and not from the self-seeking few who have made themselves powerful at the expense of the rest. But I am corrupted away from that by my affection for you, Tess," he laughed as he spoke, "and made selfish likewise. For your own sake I rejoice in your descent. Society is hopelessly snobbish, and this fact of your extraction may make an appreciable difference to its acceptance of you as my wife, after I have made you the well-read woman that I mean to make you. My mother too, poor soul, will think so much better of you on account of it. Tess, you must spell your name correctly, d'Urberville, from this very day." "I like the other way rather best." "But you must, dearest. Good heavens! Why, dozens of mushroom millionaires would jump at such a possession. By the by, there's one of that kidney who has taken the name. Where have I heard of him? Up in the neighbourhood of the Chase, I think. Why, he is the very man who had that rumpus with my father I told you of. What an odd coincidence!" "Angel, I think I would rather not take the name. It is unlucky, perhaps." She was agitated. "Now then, Mistress Teresa d'Urberville, I have you. Take my name, and so you will escape yours. The secret is out, so why should you any longer refuse me?" "If it is sure to make you happy to have me as your wife, and you feel that you do wish to marry me very, very much—" "I do, dearest, of course." "I mean that it is only your wanting me very much, and being hardly able to keep alive without me, whatever my offence is, that would make me feel I ought to say I will." "You will. You do say it, I know. You will be mine for ever and ever." He clasped her close and kissed her. "Yes." She had no sooner said it than she burst into a dry, hard sobbing, so violent that it seemed to rend her. Tess was not a hysterical girl by any means, and he was surprised. "Why do you cry, dearest?" "I can't tell quite. I'm so glad to think of being yours and making you happy. But this does not seem very much like gladness, my Tessie. I mean, I cry because I've broken down in my vow. I said I would die unmarried. But if you love me, you would like me to be your husband? Yes, yes, yes. But oh, I sometimes wish I had never been born. Now, my dear Tess, if I did not know that you are very much excited and very inexperienced, I should say that remark was not very complimentary. How came you to wish that if you care for me? Do you care for me? I wish you would prove it in some way. How can I prove it more than I have done? She cried in a distraction of tenderness. Will this prove it more? She clasped his neck, and for the first time Clare learned what an impassioned woman's kisses were like upon the lips of one whom she loved with all her heart and soul, as Tess loved him. There, now do you believe? She asked, flushed and wiping her eyes. Yes, I never really doubted. Never, never. So they drove on through the gloom, forming one bundle inside the sailcloth, the horse going as he would, and the rain driving against them. She had consented. She might as well have agreed at first. The appetite for joy which pervades all creation, that tremendous force which sways humanity to its purpose as the tide sways the helpless weed, was not to be controlled by vague lucubrations over the social rubric. "I must write to my mother," she said. "You don't mind my doing that?" "Of course not, dear child. You are a child to me, Tess, not to know how very proper it is to write to your mother at such a time, and how wrong it would be in me to object. Where does she live?" "In the same place, Marlott, on the further side of Blackmoor Vale." "Ah, then I have seen you before this summer." "Yes, at that dance on the green, but you would not dance with me. Oh, I hope that is not of ill omen for us now." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Tess of the d'Urbervilles.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Pretzelis.
Chapter 31. Tess wrote a most touching and urgent letter to her mother the very next day, and by the end of the week a response to her communication arrived in Joan Durbeyfield's wandering last-century hand. "Dear Tess, I write these few lines hoping they will find you well as they leave me at present, thank God for it. Dear Tess, we are all glad to hear that you are going really to be married soon, but with respect to your question, Tess, I say between ourselves, quite private but very strong, that on no account do you say a word of your bygone trouble to him. I did not tell everything to your father, he being so proud on account of his respectability, which perhaps your intended is the same. Many a woman, some of the highest in the land, have had a trouble in their time, and why should you trumpet yours when others don't trumpet theirs? No girl would be such a fool, especially as it is a long time ago, and not your fault at all. I shall answer the same if you ask me 50 times. Besides, you must bear in mind that, knowing it to be your childish nature to tell all that's in your heart, so simple, I made you promise me never to let it out by word or deed, having your welfare in mind, and you most solemnly did promise it going from this door. I have not named either that question or your coming marriage to your father, as he would blab it everywhere, poor simple man. Dear Tess, keep up your spirits, and we mean to send you a hogshead of cider for your wedding, knowing there is not much in your parts, and thin sour stuff there is. So no more at present, and with kind love to your young man, from your affectionate mother, J. Durbeyfield." "Oh, mother, mother," murmured Tess. She was recognizing how light was the touch of events, the most oppressive upon Mrs. Durbeyfield's elastic spirit. Her mother did not see life as Tess saw it. That haunting episode of bygone days was to her mother but a passing accident. But perhaps her mother was right as to the course to be followed, whatever she might be in her reasons. Silence seemed, on the face of it, best for her adored one's happiness. Silence it should be. Thus, steadied by a command from the only person in the world who had any shadow of right to control her action, Tess grew calmer. The responsibility was shifted, and her heart was lighter than it had been for weeks. The day of declining autumn which followed her ascent, beginning with the month of October, formed a season through which she lived in spiritual attitudes more nearly approaching ecstasy than any other period of her life. There was hardly a touch of earth in her love for Clare. To her sublime trustfulness he was all that goodness could be, knew all that a guide, philosopher and friend should know. She thought every line in the contour of his person the perfection of masculine beauty, his soul the soul of a saint, his intellect that of a seer. The wisdom of her love for him as love sustained her dignity. She seemed to be wearing a crown. The compassion of his love for her as she saw it made her lift up her heart to him in devotion. He would sometimes catch her large worshipful eyes, that had no bottom to them, looking at him from their depths, as if she saw something immortal before her. She dismissed the past, trod upon it, and put it out, as one treads upon a coal that is smouldering and dangerous. She had not known that men could be so disinterested, chivalrous, protective in their love for women as he. Angel Clare was far from all that she thought him in this respect, absurdly far indeed, but he was in truth more spiritual than animal. He had himself well in hand, and was singularly free from grossness. Though not cold-natured, he was rather bright than hot, less Byronic than Shelleyan, could love desperately, but with a love more especially inclined to the imaginative and ethereal. It was a fastidious emotion, which could jealously guard the loved one against his very self. This amazed and enraptured Tess, whose slight experiences had been so infelicitous till now, and in her reaction from indignation against the male sex she swerved to excess of honour for Clare. They unaffectedly sought each other's company. In her honest faith she did not disguise her desire to be with him. The sum of her instincts in this matter, if clearly stated, would have been that the elusive quality in her sex which attracts men in general might be distasteful to so perfect a man after an avowal of love, since it must in its very nature carry with it a suspicion of art. The country custom of unreserved comradeship out of doors during betrothal was the only custom she knew, and to her it had no strangeness, though it seemed oddly anticipative to Clare till he saw how normal a thing she, in common with all the other dairy folk, regarded it. Thus, during this October month of wonderful afternoons, they roved along the meads by creeping paths which followed the brinks of trickling tributary brooks, hopping across by little wooden bridges to the other side and back again. They were never out of the sound of some purling weir, whose bars accompanied their own murmuring, while the beams of the sun, almost as horizontal as the mead itself, formed a pollen of radiance over the landscape. They saw tiny blue fogs in the shadows of trees and hedges, all the time that there was bright sunshine elsewhere. The sun was so near the ground, and the sward so flat, that the shadows of Clare and Tess would stretch a quarter of a mile ahead of them, like two long fingers pointing afar to where the green alluvial reaches abutted against the sloping sides of the vale. Men were at work here and there, for it was the season for taking up the meadows, or digging the little waterways clear for the winter irrigation, and mending their banks where trodden down by the cows. The shovelfuls of loam, black as jet, brought there by the river when it was as wide as the whole valley, were an essence of soils, pounded champagnes of the past, steeped, refined, and subtilized to extraordinary richness, out of which came all the fertility of the mead and of the cattle grazing there. Clare hardily kept his arm round her waist in sight of these watermen, with the air of a man who was accustomed to public dalliance, though actually as shy as she, who, with lips parted and eyes askance on the labourers, wore the look of a wary animal the while. "You are not ashamed of owning me as yours before them," she said gladly. "Oh, no." "But if it should reach the ears of your friends at Erminster that you were walking about like this with me, a milkmaid, the most bewitching milkmaid ever seen, they might feel it a hurt to their dignity." "My dear girl, a d'Urberville hurt the dignity of a Clare? It is a grand card to play, that of your belonging to such a family, and I am reserving it for a grand effect when we are married, and have the proofs of your descent from Parson Tringham. Apart from that, my future is to be totally foreign to my family. It will not affect even the surface of their lives. We shall leave this part of England, perhaps England itself, and what does it matter how people regard us here? You will like going, will you not?" She could answer no more than a bare affirmative, so great was the emotion aroused in her at the thought of going through the world with him as her own familiar friend. Her feelings almost filled her ears like a babble of waves, and surged up to her eyes. She put her hand in his, and thus they went on to a place where the reflected sun glared up from the river under a bridge with a molten metallic glow that dazzled their eyes, though the sun itself was hidden by the bridge. They stood still, whereupon little furred and feathered heads popped up from the smooth surface of the water, but finding that the disturbing presences had paused and not passed by, they disappeared again. Upon this river brink they lingered till the fog began to close round them, which was very early in the evening at this time of the year, settling on the lashes of her eyes, where it rested like crystals, and on his brows and hair. They walked later on Sundays, when it was quite dark. Some of the dairy people, who were also out of doors on the first Sunday evening after their engagement, heard her impulsive speeches ecstaticized to fragments, though they were too far off to hear the words discoursed, noted the spasmodic catch in her remarks, broken into syllables by the leapings of her heart as she walked leaning on his arm, her contented pauses, the occasional little laugh upon which her soul seemed to ride, the laugh of a woman in company with the man she loves, and as one from all other women, unlike anything else in nature. They marked the buoyancy of her tread, like the skim of a bird which has not quite alighted. Her affection for him was now the breath and life of Tess's being. It enveloped her as a photosphere, irradiated her into forgetfulness of her past sorrows, keeping back the gloomy spectres that would persist in their attempts to touch her: doubt, fear, moodiness, care, shame. She knew that they were waiting like wolves just outside the circumscribing light, but she had long spells of power to keep them in hungry subjection there. A spiritual forgetfulness coexisted with an intellectual remembrance. She walked in brightness, but she knew that in the background those shapes of darkness were always spread. They might be receding, or they might be approaching, one or the other, a little every day. One evening Tess and Clare were obliged to sit indoors keeping house, all the other occupants of the domicile being away. As they talked she looked thoughtfully up at him, and met his two appreciative eyes. "I am not worthy of you, no, I am not!" she burst out, jumping up from her low stool as though appalled at his homage and the fulness of her own joy thereat. Clare, deeming the whole basis of her excitement to be that which was only the smaller part of it, said, "I won't have you speak like it, dear Tess. Distinction does not consist in the facile use of a contemptible set of conventions, but in being numbered among those who are true and honest and just and pure and lovely and of good report, as you are, my Tess." She struggled with the sob in her throat. How often had that string of excellencies made her young heart ache in church of late years, and how strange that he should have cited them now. "Why didn't you stay and love me when I was 16, living with my little sisters and brothers, and you danced on the green? Oh, why didn't you? Why didn't you?" she said impetuously, clasping her hands. Angel began to comfort and reassure her, thinking to himself truly enough what a creature of moods she was, and how careful he would have to be of her when she depended for her happiness entirely upon him. "Ah, why didn't I stay?" he said. "That is just what I feel. If I had only known. But you must not be so bitter in your regard. Why should you be?" With the woman's instinct to hide, she diverged hastily. "I should have had 4 more years of your heart than I can ever have now. Then I should not have wasted my time as I have done. I should have had so much longer happiness." It was no mature woman with a dark vista of intrigue behind her who was tormented thus, but a girl of simple life, not yet 21, who had been caught during her days of immaturity like a bird in a springe. To calm herself the more completely, she rose from her little stool and left the room, overturning the stool with her skirts as she went. He sat on by the cheerful firelight thrown from a bundle of green ash sticks laid across the dogs. The sticks snapped pleasantly, and hissed out bubbles of sap from their ends. When she came back she was herself again. "Do you not think you are just a wee bit capricious, fitful, Tess?" he said good-humouredly, as he spread a cushion for her on the stool, and seated himself in the settle beside her. "I wanted to ask you something, and just then you ran away." "Yes, perhaps I am capricious," she murmured. She suddenly approached him, and put a hand upon each of his arms. "No, Angel, I am not really so, by nature I mean." The more particularly to assure him that she was not, she placed herself close to him on the settle, and allowed her head to find a resting place against Clare's shoulder. "What did you want to ask me? I'm sure I will answer it," she continued humbly. "Well, you love me, and have agreed to marry me, and hence there follows a thirdly. When shall the day be?" "I like living like this." "But I must think of starting in business on my own hook with the new year, or a little later, and before I get involved in the multifarious details of my new position I should like to have secured my partner." "But," she timidly answered, "to talk quite practically, wouldn't it be best not to marry till after all that? Though I can't bear the thought of your going away and leaving me here." "Of course you cannot, and it is not best in this case. I want you to help me in many ways in making my start. When shall it be? Why not a fortnight from now?" "No," she said, becoming grave. "I have so many things to think of first." But he drew her gently near to him. The reality of marriage was startling when it loomed so near. Before discussion of the question had proceeded further, there walked around the corner of the settle into the full firelight of the apartment Mr Dairyman Crick, Mrs Crick, and two of the milkmaids. Tess sprang like an elastic ball from his side to her feet, while her face flushed and her eyes shone in the firelight. "I knew how it would be if I sat so close to him," she cried with vexation. "I said to myself, they are sure to come and catch us, and I wasn't really sitting on his knee, though it might have seemed as if I was almost."
"Well, if so be you hadn't told us, I'm sure we shouldn't have noticed that you had been sitting anywhere at all in this light," replied the dairyman. He continued to his wife with the solid mien of a man who understood nothing of the emotions related to matrimony. "Now, Christianer, that shows that folks should never fancy other folks be supposing things when they bain't. Oh no, I should never have thought a word of where she was a sitting to if she hadn't told me, not I." "We're going to be married soon," said Clare with improvised phlegm. "Ah, and be ye? Well, I'm truly glad to hear it, sir. I thought you mid do such a thing for some time. She's too good for a dairymaid. I said so the very first day I zid her, and a prize for any man, and what's more, a wonderful woman for a gentleman farmer's wife. He won't be at the mercy of his baily with her at his side." Somehow Tess disappeared. She had been even more struck with the look of the girls who followed Crick than abashed by Crick's blunt praise. After supper, when she reached her bedroom, they were all present. A light was burning, and each damsel was sitting up whitely in her bed, awaiting Tess, the whole like a row of avenging ghosts. But she saw in a few moments that there was no malice in their mood. They could scarcely feel as a loss what they had never expected to have. Their condition was objective, contemplative. "He's going to marry her," murmured Retty, never taking her eyes off Tess. "How her face do show it!" "You be going to marry him?" asked Marian. "Yes," said Tess. "When?"
"Some day." They thought this was evasiveness only. "Yes, going to marry him, a gentleman," repeated Izz Huett, and by a sort of fascination the three girls, one after another, crept out of their beds and came and stood barefooted around Tess. Retty put her hands upon Tess's shoulders, as if to realise her friend's corporality after such a miracle, and the other two laid their arms around her waist, all looking into her face. "How it do seem, almost more than I can think of," said Izz Huett. Marian kissed Tess. "Yes," she murmured as she withdrew her lips. "Was that because of love of her, or because other lips have touched there by now?" continued Izz dryly to Marian. "I wasn't thinking of that," said Marian simply. "I was only feeling all the strangeness on't, that she is to be his wife, and nobody else. I don't say nay to it, nor either of us, because we did not think of it, only loved him. Still, nobody else is to Marian in the world, no fine lady, nobody in silks and satins, but she who do live like we." "Are you sure you don't dislike me for it?" said Tess in a low voice. They hung about her in their white nightgowns before replying, as if they considered their answer might lie in her look. I don't know," murmured Retty Priddle. "I want to hate 'ee, but I cannot." "That's how I feel," echoed Izz and Marian. "I can't hate her,
Somehow she hinders me." "He ought to marry one of you," murmured Tess. "Why?" "You are all better than I." "We better than you?" said the girls in a low, slow whisper. "No, no, dear Tess." "You are," she contradicted impetuously; and suddenly tearing away from their clinging arms she burst into a hysterical fit of tears, bowing herself on the chest of drawers, and repeating incessantly, "Oh yes, yes, yes!" Having once given way, she could not stop her weeping. "He ought to have had one of you," she cried. "I think I ought to make him even now. You would be better for him than—I don't know what I'm saying. Oh, oh!" They went up to her and clasped her round, but still her sobs tore her. "Get some water," said Marian. "She's upset by us, poor thing, poor thing." They gently led her back to the side of her bed, where they kissed her warmly. "You are best for'n," said Marian. "More ladylike, and a better scholar than we, especially since he has taught 'ee so much. But even you ought to be proud. You be proud, I'm sure." "Yes, I am," she said, "and I am ashamed at so breaking down." When they were all in bed and the light out, Marian whispered across to her, "You will think of us when you be his wife, Tess, and how we told 'ee that we loved him, and how we tried not to hate you, and did not hate you, and could not hate you, because you were his choice, and we never hoped to be chose by him." They were not aware that, at these words, salt stinging tears trickled down upon Tess's pillow anew, and how she resolved with a bursting heart to tell all her history to Angel Clare, despite her mother's command; to let him for whom she lived and breathed despise her if he would, and her mother regard her as a fool, rather than preserve a silence which might be deemed a treachery to him, and which somehow seemed a wrong to these. Chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Tess of the d'Urbervilles.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Pretzelis.
Chapter 32. This penitential mood kept her from naming the wedding day. The beginning of November found its date still in abeyance, though he asked her at the most tempting times. But Tess's desire seemed to be for a perpetual betrothal in which everything should remain as it was then. The meads were changing now, but it was still warm enough in the early afternoons before milking to idle there a while, and the state of dairy work at this time of year allowed a spare hour for idling. Looking over the damp sod in the direction of the sun, a glistening ripple of gossamer webs was visible to their eyes under the luminary, like the track of moonlight on the sea. Gnats, knowing nothing of their brief glorification, wandered across the shimmer of this pathway, irradiated as if they bore fire within them, then passed out of its line and were quite extinct. In the presence of these things he would remind her that the date was still the question. Or he would ask her at night, when he accompanied her on some mission invented by Mrs. Crick to give him the opportunity. This was mostly a journey to the farmhouse on the slopes above the vale, to inquire how the advanced cows were getting on in the straw barton to which they were relegated. It was a time of the year that brought great changes to the world of kine. Batches of the animals were sent away daily to this lying-in hospital, where they lived on straw till their calves were born, after which event, and as soon as the calf could walk, mother and offspring were driven back to the dairy. In the interval which elapsed before the calves were sold there was, of course, little milking to be done, but as soon as the calf had been taken away The milkmaids would have to set to work as usual. Returning from one of these dark walks, they reached the great gravel cliff immediately over the levels, where they stood and listened. The water was now high in the streams, squirting through the weirs and tinkling under culverts. The smallest gullies were all full. There was no taking short cuts anywhere, and foot passengers were compelled to follow the permanent ways. From the whole extent of the invisible vale came a multitudinous intonation. It forced upon their fancy that a great city lay below them, and that the murmur was the vociferation of its populace. "It seems like tens of thousands of them," said Tess, "holding public meetings in their market-places, arguing, preaching, quarrelling, sobbing, groaning, praying and cursing." Clare was not particularly heeding. "Did Crick speak to you to-day, dear, about his not wanting much assistance during the winter months?" "No." "The cows are going dry rapidly." "Yes, 6 or 7 went to the straw barton yesterday, and 3 the day before, making nearly 20 in the straw already." "Ah, is it that the farmer don't want my help for the calving? Oh, I'm not wanted here any more, and I've tried so hard to—" "Crick didn't exactly say that he would no longer require you, but knowing what our relations were, he said in the most good-mannered and respectful manner possible that he supposed on my leaving at Christmas I should take you with me, and on my asking what he would do without you, he merely observed that, as a matter of fact, it was a time of year when he could do with very little female help. I'm afraid I was sinner enough to feel rather glad that he was in this way forcing your hand." "I don't think you ought to have felt glad, Angel, 'cause 'tis always mournful not to be wanted, even if at the same time 'tis convenient." "Well, it is convenient. You have admitted that." He put his finger upon her cheek. "Ah," he said. "What?" "I feel the red rising up at her having been caught. But why should I trifle so? We will not trifle. Life is too serious." "It is. Perhaps I saw that before you did." She was seeing it then. To decline to marry him after all, in obedience to her emotion of last night, and leave the dairy, meant to go to some strange place, not a dairy, for milkmaids were not in request now calving time was coming on, to go to some arable farm where no divine being like Angel Clare was. She hated the thought, and she hated more the thought of going home. "So that, seriously, dear Tess," he continued, "since you will probably have to leave at Christmas, it is in every way desirable and convenient that I should carry you off then as my property. Besides, if you are not the most uncalculating girl in the world, you would know that we could not go on like this for ever." "I wish we could, that it would always be summer and autumn, and you always courting me and always thinking as much of me as you have done through the past summer-time." "I always shall." "Oh, I know you will," she cried, with a sudden fervour of faith in him. "Angel, I will fix the day when I will become yours for always." Thus at last it was arranged between them, during that dark walk home, amid the myriads of liquid voices on the right and left. When they reached the dairy, Mr. and Mrs. Crick were promptly told, with injunctions to secrecy, for each of the lovers was desirous that the marriage should be kept as private as possible. The dairyman, though he had thought of dismissing her soon, now made a great concern about losing her. What should he do about his skimming? Who would make the ornamental butter pats for the Anglebury and Sandbourne ladies? Mrs. Crick congratulated Tess on the shilly-shallying having at last come to an end, and said that directly she'd set eyes on Tess she divined that she was to be the chosen one of somebody who was no common outdoor man. Tess had looked so superior as she walked across the barton on that afternoon of her arrival that she was of a good family she could have sworn. In point of fact, Mrs. Crick did remember thinking that Tess was graceful and good-looking as she approached, but the superiority might have been a growth of the imagination, added by subsequent knowledge. Tess was now carried along on the wings of the hours, without a sense of a will. The word had been given, the number of the day written down. Her naturally bright intelligence had begun to admit the fatalistic convictions common to field folk and those who associate more extensively with natural phenomena than with their fellow creatures, and she accordingly drifted into that passive responsiveness to all things her lover suggested, characteristic of the frame of mind. But she wrote anew to her mother, ostensibly to notify the wedding day, really to again implore her advice. It was a gentleman who had chosen her, which perhaps her mother had not sufficiently considered. A post-nuptial explanation, which might be accepted with a light heart by a rougher man, might not be received with the same feeling by him. But this communication brought no reply from Mrs Durbeyfield. Despite Angel Clare's plausible representations to himself and to Tess of the practical need for their immediate marriage, there was in truth an element of precipitancy in the step, as became apparent at a later date. He loved her dearly, though perhaps rather ideally and fancifully than with the impassioned thoroughness of her feeling for him. He had entertained no notion, when doomed he had thought to an unintellectual bucolic life, that such charms as he beheld in this idyllic creature would be found behind the scenes. Unsophistication was a thing to talk of, but he had not known how it really struck one until he came here. Yet he was very far from seeing his future track clearly, and it might be a year or two before he was able to consider himself fairly started in life. The secret lay in the tinge of recklessness imparted to his career and character by the sense that he had been made to miss his true destiny through the prejudices of his family. "Don't you think 'twould have been better for us to wait till you were quite settled in your Midland farm?" she once asked timidly. A Midland farm was the idea just then. To tell the truth, my Tess, I don't like you to be left anywhere away from my protection and sympathy." The reason was a good one, so far as it went. His influence over her had been so marked that she had caught his manners and habits, his speech and phrases, his likings and his aversions, and to leave her in farmland would be to let her slip back again out of accord with him. He wished to have her under his charge for another reason. His parents had naturally desired to see her once at least before he carried her off to a distant settlement, English or colonial, and as no opinion of theirs was to be allowed to change his intention, he judged that a couple of months' life with him in lodgings, whilst seeking for an advantageous opening, would be of some social assistance to her at what she might feel to be a trying ordeal, her presentation to his mother at the vicarage. Next he wished to see a little of the working of a flour mill, having an idea that he might combine the use of one with corn growing. The proprietor of an old water mill at Wellbridge, once the mill of an abbey, had offered him the inspection of his time-honoured mode of procedure, and a hand in the operations for a few days whenever he should choose to come. Clare paid a visit to the place, some few miles distant, one day at this time to inquire particulars, and returned to Talbothays in the evening. She found him determined to spend a short time at the Wellbridge flour mills. And what had determined him? Less the opportunity of an insight into grinding and bolting than the casual fact that lodgings were to be obtained in that very farmhouse which, before its mutilation, had been the mansion of a branch of the d'Urberville family. This was always how Clare settled practical questions, by a sentiment which had nothing to do with them. They decided to go immediately after the wedding, and remain for a fortnight, instead of journeying to towns and inns. "Then we will start off to examine some farms on the other side of London that I have heard of," he said, "and by March or April we will pay a visit to my father and mother." Questions of procedure such as these arose and passed, and the day, the incredible day on which she was to become his, loomed large in the near future. The 31st of December, New Year's Eve, was the date. His wife, she said to herself, could it ever be? Their two selves together, nothing to divide them, every incident shared by them? Why not? And yet, why? One Sunday morning Izz Huett returned from church and spoke privately to Tess. "You was not called home this morning." Footnote: called home, local phrase for publication of banns. End of footnote. "What?" "It should have been the first time of asking today," she answered, looking quietly at Tess. "You meant to be married New Year's Eve, dearie." The other returned a quick affirmative. "Then there must be 3 times of asking, and now there'll be only 2 Sundays left between." Tess felt her cheek paling. Izz was right. Of course there must be 3. Perhaps he had forgotten. If so, there must be a week's postponement, and that was unlucky. How could she remind her lover? She who had been so backward was suddenly fired with impatience and alarm lest she should lose her dear prize. A natural incident relieved her anxiety. Izz mentioned the omission of the banns to Mrs Crick, and Mrs Crick assumed a matron's privilege of speaking to Angel on the point. "Have ye forgotten 'em, Mr Clare? The banns, I mean." "No, I have not forgot 'em," said Clare. As soon as he caught Tess alone he assured her. "Don't let them tease you about the banns. A licence will be quieter for us, and so I have decided on a licence without consulting you. So if you go to church on Sunday morning you will not hear your own name, if you wished to." "I didn't wish to hear it, dearest," she said proudly. But to know that things were in train was an immense relief to Tess, notwithstanding, who had been well nigh feared that someone would stand up and forbid the banns on the ground of her history. How events were favouring her! "I don't feel easy," she said to herself. "All this good fortune may be scourged out of me afterwards by a lot of ill. That's how heaven mostly does. I wish I could have had common banns." But everything went smoothly. She wondered whether he would like her to be married in her present best white frock, or if she ought to buy a new one. The question was set at rest by his forethought, disclosed by the arrival of some large packages addressed to her. Inside them she found a whole stock of clothing, from bonnet to shoes, including a perfect morning costume, such as would well support the simple wedding they planned. He entered the house shortly after the arrival of the packages, and heard her upstairs undoing them. A minute later she came down with a flush on her face and tears in her eyes. "How thoughtful you've been," she murmured, her cheek upon his shoulder. "Even to the gloves and handkerchief. My own love, how good, how kind." "No, no, Tess, just an order to a tradeswoman in London, nothing more." And to divert her from thinking too highly of him, he told her to go upstairs and take her time, and see if it all fitted, and if not, to get the village seamstress to make a few alterations. She did return upstairs and put on the gown. Alone, she stood for a moment before the glass, looking at the effect of her silk attire, and then there came into her head her mother's ballad of the mystic robe that never would become that wife that had once done amiss, which Mrs Durbeyfield used to sing to her as a child, so blithely and so archly, her foot on the cradle, which she rocked to the tune. Suppose this robe should betray her by changing colour, as her robe had betrayed Queen Guinevere. Since she had been at the dairy she had not once thought of the lines, till now. End of chapter 32